Father Matthew had served St. Bridget's for over 30 years. The small church sat at the heart of the town of Dunning, tucked between dense woods and rolling fields, its once proud stone walls now weathered and worn. The town itself was no better, a shadow of its former self, with empty shops, peeling paint, and homes that seemed to sag under the weight of time. The one thing that had never changed in Dunning was the silence. The town was too small for the noise of the city, and too old to carry the liveliness of youth. At dusk, the streets became deserted, as if an invisible curfew had been imposed. It was the kind of silence that seeped into your bones, lingering long after you'd left. In the confessional, though, silence was more than an absence of sound. It was law. No one knew when the rule had started, perhaps in Father Matthew's youth or in the time of his predecessor. But in St. Bridget's confessional, only the priest was permitted to speak. Confessors would enter, kneel behind the screen, and wait. Father Matthew would offer forgiveness, prayer, or advice, but he never heard the sins themselves. It had been this way for as long as he could remember. A strange tradition, but one that was followed without question. Then came the night when everything changed. It was late, much later than usual, when Father Matthew heard the door to the confessional creak open. He was exhausted, having just finished evening mass for the handful of elderly parishioners who still attended. The wooden bench beneath him groaned under his weight as he shifted uncomfortably in the cramped space. The church was nearly pitch black now, lit only by the flickering glow of a few dying candles. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," came a whisper from the other side of the screen. Father Matthew sat up straight. He had been about to begin his usual recitation, but the confessor had spoken first, breaking the rule. His heart gave a small, startled leap, but he forced himself to remain composed. "You are not to speak," Father Matthew said quietly, his voice as steady as he could manage. "It is tradition that I speak on your behalf. You need only listen." There was silence for a moment, a long, unnatural silence. Then the voice spoke again. "My sins are not the kind you can forgive, Father." There was something about the voice, a rasping, strained quality that made Father Matthew's skin prickle. It wasn't the voice of someone familiar, and in Dunning he knew nearly every soul by heart. He leaned forward, pressing his fingers to his temples as a cold unease crept through him. "You must remain silent," he repeated, but the words felt hollow. A breath, ragged and drawn out, filled the small space between them. "I've seen the truth," the voice whispered, the tone trembling with an eerie weight. "This town, it's not what it seems. There are things here, things that linger, things that don't let go." Father Matthew felt his heart skip. His hands clenched tightly around the edges of his cassock. The walls of the confessional seemed to close in on him, suffocating in their closeness. He had lived his entire life in Dunning, never once questioning its stillness. But something in the voice told him to listen, against all reason. "What truth?" Father Matthew asked, though his mouth felt dry. His breath came out in short, shallow puffs. He was breaking the rule himself now, but the old fear of silence had begun to gnaw at him. The voice on the other side let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "The dead don't leave Dunning, Father. They stay. They walk these streets. They sit in your pews. They pray alongside the living, unseen, unheard. But they're here." Father Matthew felt a chill crawl up his spine, coiling around his throat like a noose. His mind raced, grasping for logic, for reason. The voice, it had to be some troubled soul, some lost sinner speaking madness in the dead of night. That's what it was. Surely, that's all it was. But even as he tried to convince himself, something in the back of his mind stirred, a memory long buried, that he had never questioned until now. The faces in the church pews, week after week, so familiar yet so unchanging. The same people, the same places, as if they never aged, never left. "Who are you?" Father Matthew whispered, the words trembling on his lips. The voice responded with a bitter, quiet laugh, dripping with sorrow. "I used to sit in your church every Sunday, Father. You used to bless me, but I died 20 years ago." The blood drained from Father Matthew's face. The air in the confessional grew thick, suffocating. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. This was wrong. This was not the way things were supposed to be. "You're lying," he said, more to himself than to the confessor. "This is blasphemy." "Look outside," the voice said, softer now. the edge of desperation creeping in. "Look at the faces in your church. Really look." Father Matthew's hands trembled as he fumbled for the door to the confessional, stumbling out into the darkened church. His feet felt heavy, like he was moving through water. His breath came in ragged gasps. The pews stretched before him, shadowy figures seated in the rows, heads bowed in silent prayer. But the voice echoed in his mind, "They don't leave." He stepped into the aisle, his legs weak, and looked out over the congregation. His heart froze in his chest. They were the same faces that had sat in those pews for years, decades even. Faces that had never aged, never changed. An icy hand gripped his soul as he recognized them, names and faces from funeral services he himself had conducted. Old Mrs. O'Leary, who had passed away 15 years ago. John, the baker, who had died in his sleep a decade past. Young Emily, taken by a fever. All of them, sitting, praying, as if they had never died. Father Matthew stumbled backward, his breath hitching in his throat. His mind screamed for reason, but the truth pressed in around him like a suffocating fog. The dead had never left Dunning. They had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, and worse, he had blessed them, prayed with them, preached to them, never once seeing the truth. The voice from the confessional spoke once more, but now it came from all around him, whispering from the darkened corners of the church, from the pews, from the very walls themselves. "You've been keeping us here, Father. Your prayers, your sermons, they bind us. We cannot leave. We are trapped in this town waiting, always waiting." "No," Father Matthew gasped, stumbling back toward the altar. "I didn't know. I didn't." "Look at us," the voice demanded, rising to a deafening roar. The figures in the pews turned their heads in unison, their eyes hollow, empty, void of life. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out, only a deafening, suffocating silence. And then the voice spoke again, soft and cold. "You're one of us now, Father." Father Matthew's breath stopped as he felt the weight of the truth crash down on him. He looked down at his own hands, pale, thin, trembling. He had always been tired, always felt so weak, so worn down. How many years had it been? How long had he walked these halls, said these prayers? He had never left either. The last light of the candles flickered out, plunging the church into darkness. The next morning, the parishioners of Dunning came to St. Bridget's for Mass, as they always did. Father Matthew's seat behind the altar was empty, as it had been for years. But in the confessional, the door creaked open. A figure knelt behind the screen, waiting, as the silence stretched on. In Dunning, no one ever left, not even the priest. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short, scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire.